Ben Stone had no idea that his routine hike through the Appalachian Trail would take such a bizarre turn. Exhausted and lost, he couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was following him. But it wasn't until he heard the faint, unmistakable sound of a baby crying deep in the woods that his heart raced with both confusion and fear. Was his mind playing tricks on him? He had to find out, but what he discovered next would make him question everything he knew about these woods. Before we continue, please take some time to subscribe to Dailydose, like, and share this video with your friends. It was as if his legs were on fire. This was the longest hike he had ever taken. Though he thought he was almost there, he was never able to locate the end. The wet mulch beneath his boots scrunched with every step he took. As the exhausted man grew more worried, he realized he was miles from civilization. If anything were to happen to him, no one would be able to find him. The man was lost. After hiking the Appalachian Trail for weeks, Ben Stone thought he had seen everything. A sound caught his attention one day as he walked through the dense forest. Even though he was a seasoned hiker on the Appalachian Trail, his age now prevented him from tackling the expert trails like he once did. What once was easy for him was now quite challenging. Occasionally a twig snapped and leaves rustled, making him nervous. Every sound sounded louder than it actually was, as if his mind was playing tricks on him. Bears and other wild animals lived in the area, and the thought of coming across one terrified him to his very core. As time passed, he only became more paranoid. He had been walking for days, and the rugged terrain was wearing him out. In the late afternoon, the sun was setting, and it was time to set up camp. Throughout the trees, the mournful wail echoed. The first thing he thought was that it was a lost cub crying for its mother, but the closer he got, the clearer it became. But was it safe to go any closer? It sounded like the cry of a human baby. The sounds that Ben was hearing caused his heart to race. He hoped that his ears were misleading him. It seemed like he was hearing and seeing things at the same time. Despite this, Ben couldn't ignore the cry, which prompted him to seek out the source of the sound. But what would he stumble across? His tent was pitched in a clearing, but he felt uneasy about the encroaching darkness. However, he was overcome by curiosity. Following the noise, he stumbled over rocks and fallen branches as he pushed his way through the underbrush. After walking for what seemed like hours, the sound never got closer. He kept expecting to find the source of the sound behind the next tree, but he never did. In the fading light of the sun, Ben realized he had no idea where he was. After straying from the trail, he didn't know how to get back. The thought of spending the night alone in the woods set in, and panic set in. It was impossible for him to ignore the sound of the crying baby. The problem had to be found, and it needed to be solved. In spite of his sore legs and parched throat, he kept pushing forward. Despite his fears, he tried to remain brave. Suddenly, Ben realized that he was lost as the last rays of the sun began to set. He had no idea where he was or how to return to the trail. Despite his best efforts to stay calm, his heart was pounding. Among Ben Stone's many accomplishments, he had traversed the Appalachian Trail many times. A rustle of leaves or the distant call of animals were familiar sounds to him. As he walked through the thick forest, he heard an odd sound. The sound resembled that of an injured animal or a lost cub crying for its mother. After hearing the noise, he followed it, his heart breaking for the poor creature. After getting closer, he realized the sound was too high-pitched for a cub. The sound resembled that of a human baby. Shaking his head, he thought he must be hearing things. The cry persisted, tugging at his heartstrings. It was important for him to find the source of the sound and to ensure that the baby was well. He walked for hours, feeling as if his mind was playing tricks on him. Whenever a leaf rustled or a twig snapped, he jumped, believing something was following him. He always carried an army knife in case anything went wrong. It was becoming apparent to him that he had made a bad choice. He kept looking behind his back. However, there was nothing there. He even spotted a small coyote cub at one point, but it was not the source of the crying. Although he knew he was close to some camp, the feeling of being watched couldn't be shaken. His search for the voice turned up nothing. The woods were hiding something, but what was it? He heard a faint cry as he lay in his tent. The cry grew louder and louder, and he assumed it was just his imagination. Again, it sounded like a baby crying. The situation puzzled Ben. It had been an exhausting day. In his mind, the cry he heard was nothing more than the wind whispering in the mountains. It seemed strange to him that a baby would be out in the middle of nowhere. The night fell, and Ben's nerves began to fray. Even though he tried to distract himself by reading, the sound of the crying baby kept ringing in his ears. Then it started again. The sound of a small child wailing softly filled the quiet night. It was definitely real this time, Ben was certain. He jumped in his skin when something suddenly shook his tent. Listening intently, he sat frozen. There was another shake, this one a bit stronger. Unzipping the tent slowly, he reached for his flashlight. The only thing he saw outside was darkness. His ears caught the sound of a baby crying again. In an effort to figure out where it came from, he shone his light around. A tremor ran through his body. He had never been this scared before. With his flashlight, he searched the area outside his tent. As he followed the sound of the crying, he came across a bush. He saw a bundle of cloth as he shone his flashlight on the bush. In spite of his desire to pick it up, he was scared to do so. How did it end up there? As Ben held the crying baby in his arms, his heart raced. He didn't know what to do. He knew that he was thousands of miles from civilization, and he had no way of contacting anyone. A supernatural event was taking place. He decided to take the baby with him and to find help wherever he could. Surely someone would have the answer. It was then that he saw it. In the distance, a figure holding a crying bundle stood dark and shadowy. He felt his heart stop beating. Could it have been a ghost? Could it be a hallucination? In spite of his attempts to back away, the figure stepped closer, making the crying louder. His eyes opened wide when he realized what he'd seen. This wasn't a ghost or a hallucination. There was a woman reaching out to the baby. As Ben's mind raced, he felt dizzy. Why would there be a woman and a baby out here in the middle of nowhere? Did they get lost as well? As he rubbed his eyes, he took a deep breath. His heart pounded as he stepped closer. Neither of them spoke for a moment as they just stared at one another. In a soft, trembling voice, she spoke. "Please," she said, holding out the baby. "Help us." A surge of emotion overtook Ben. Holding the baby carefully in his arms, he cradled it. Tears streamed down the woman's face as she shook. After talking for a while, Ben learned more about the woman. While camping with her husband and baby, a sudden storm hit. After being separated for hours, she wandered through the woods trying to find her way back to the campsite. It was clear to Ben that he had to help them. After leading the woman to his tent, he gave her and the baby some food and water. Only a few bites of food were eaten, and she only wanted to rest. The two of them spoke for hours on end, and before they knew it, it was late into the night. By the time they had gone to bed, Ben knew he'd made a friend. But could he trust the unknown woman? Ben led the woman and the baby back to the trail the next morning. Ben held the baby in his arms as they hiked together, the baby cooing and giggling in his arms. The thought that something strange was happening seemed silly to Ben, but the truth should have been obvious to him. It is possible to get lost in the woods sometimes. The explanation was logical. She turned to him after reaching the end of the trail, tears in her eyes. "Thank you so much," she replied. A smile spread across Ben's face as he struggled to hold on to the rocks. Ben struggled to climb up the steep cliff while holding a baby, and when he looked back down, the woman had mysteriously disappeared. What on earth was going on? There was no sign of her. 1 second was not enough time for her to disappear. What happened to the strange woman? He glanced at the mountainous area. She was nowhere to be seen. Ben's heart was racing. Suddenly, the baby began screaming in Ben's arms. Ben and the foreign baby were stranded in an unfamiliar place. Where was he supposed to go from here? With the baby in his arms, Ben's mind raced while he made his way through the forest. The idea of a baby being in the middle of nowhere seemed impossible to him. How had that happened? It was unclear whether the woman had abandoned the baby or if it had been separated from its real parents. The information he had wasn't solid. Did he imagine that the woman was there? In the course of the day, Ben's exhaustion began to catch up with him. The baby could not be left alone while he searched for a safe place to rest. After finding a small clearing, he quickly found his way back to his tent, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of his neck. In search of a safe place to set up camp, he continued hiking. Having been out for so long, he was exhausted and wanted to get rest as soon as possible. A surprise awaited him in the night. A sound suddenly echoed behind him. There was a sound of something moving through the forest. His neck hair stood up. Just like the night before, it was the same. The flashlight he was holding flashed into the darkness, and Ben's heart raced. The sound continued, but he did not see anything. The presence was overpowering. He could sense it close by. Trying to separate himself from whatever was following him, he quickened his pace. The sound grew louder, and he realized that he was being chased. In a desperate attempt to find safety, he broke into a run. He heard the sound of his tent shaking as he ran. There was no doubt that he was being pursued. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed himself harder. He had no other option than to keep running. A clearing appeared ahead of him. Trying to find safety there, he sprinted towards it. Upon entering the clearing, he saw a small cabin. He just got lucky. Hopeful that someone was inside, he ran towards it. As he burst through the door, he gasped for breath. An individual sat outside in surprise with a gun in hand. What's going on? He frowned. His explanation was hampered by his exhaustion. After handing the man the crying baby, he collapsed onto a chair. Surprise filled the man's eyes as he looked at the baby. "Where did you find this?" he asked. He listened, his face growing grave. "You have to call the authorities," he said. "This baby needs help." He tried again to explain the situation to the best of his abilities. "There was a woman, the mother. She's gone." The ranger tried to calm him down. Ben nodded, grateful for the man's assistance. After pulling out his phone, he dialed 911. During his conversation with the operator, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. Now that he had done the right thing, the baby would be safe. Ben felt grateful towards the man who helped him as he awaited the authorities' arrival. Trying to explain what was happening in the forest, he told the ranger there was something out there.